Hello again. Last time we looked at the medieval period, which ended in 1485 with the Battle of Bosworth and Henry VII taking the throne. This was the beginning of a new royal dynasty, the Tudors. Although Henry married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, thereby uniting the warring houses of York and Lancaster, the crown sat uneasily on his head for many years. The first attempt to restore the House of York came at Easter 1486, with a short-lived rebellion led by Francis Lovell in the north and the Stafford brothers in the south. Lovell had supported the future Richard III during a campaign in Scotland in 1480 and had been knighted by him. He had fought alongside Richard at Bosworth. Following the failed rebellion, he fled to the Netherlands in the court of Margaret of York. Margaret of York, Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, was the sister of Richard III and Edward IV, widow of Charles the Bold of Burgundy. She supported any cause which opposed Henry VII. John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, was a nephew of both Edward IV and Richard III, and had unofficially been nominated heir to the throne by Richard III before his death at Bosworth. When Henry VII took the throne, he was initially reconciled with Tudor rule, but soon became impatient. He joined Lovell at the court of Margaret of York. She funded the hire and shipping of the Swiss and German mercenaries to Ireland, led by Martin Schwartz. Martin Schwartz had made his reputation fighting for Charles the Bold of Burgundy before joining the forces of Maximilian, the future Holy Roman Emperor. The Landsknechts were professional infantrymen who had fought for Maximilian against rebels in the Low Countries and ended his wars against France. They were armed with two-handed swords, crossbows, and probably an early type of handgun. Meanwhile in Oxford, Lambert Simnel, probably the son of a tradesman and born around 1477, so around the same age as Edward, Earl of Warwick, son of George, Duke of Clarence, was being tutored by the scholar priest Richard or William Simmons in courtly manners so that he could impersonate a Yorkist prince. He was referred to by the Herald as the only John, and it is unlikely that his name was either Lambert or Simnel. Simnel was taken to Ireland, where the Yorkist cause still had widespread support. They were joined there by the Earl of Lincoln and Lovell. Following Lincoln's arrival in Dublin, the Irish nobles decided to crown Simnel as Edward VI in Christchurch Cathedral, with a gold coronet borrowed from a statue of the Virgin Mary. Following his coronation, he was borne through Dublin on the shoulders of Lord Darcy of Platten, the tallest man around. The rebels now had the support of many of the most senior Irish nobles and churchmen. They sailed for England with 1,500 to 2,000 mercenaries led by Schwartz, and 4,000 Irish troops led by Fitzgerald. The Irish forces under Fitzgerald were poorly clothed and armed in comparison with the Landsknechts they were going to fight alongside. On the 4th of June they landed at Furness in Cumbria. Henry presumed that Lincoln would invade eastern England, whilst the Irish attacked in the west. He decided to muster his forces at Coventry by the 22nd of April. Once he realised that Lincoln had gone to Ireland, he stood some of his men down and based himself at Kenilworth Castle to await developments. Landing on the west coast, the rebels began their march towards York and had reached Masham by the 8th of June. Lincoln hoped to pick up support in the north, but he was not very successful, possibly because of the fear of the number of foreigners in his army. Because of this, Schwartz believed that the Earl had deceived himself and Schwartz as to the level of support they would receive. Although Lincoln and Lovell were well known in York and expected support, the city fathers had been professing their loyalty to Henry and had appealed for reinforcement and cannons. They also knew that royal forces under the Earl of Northumberland and Henry Lord Clifford were near, so rejected the appeal from Simnel for support. In the event, Lincoln decided to bypass the city and head south to confront the king. Meanwhile, Henry had been alerted and moved his forces to Leicester, where he arrived on Trinity Sunday. He then crossed the Leicestershire-Nottinghamshire border on Tuesday the 12th of June, moving slowly to allow as many of his supporters as possible to join him with their men. Henry now had support from the Earl of Oxford, his uncle Jasper Tudor, Duke of Bedford, the Earls of Devon and Shrewsbury, Viscount Lisle, 5 barons including Lord Hastings, and according to the Herald at least 12 knights. John de Vere, 13th Earl of Oxford, had led Henry's forces at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. He was Henry's most experienced commander by far. Henry and his troops spent Tuesday night at Bunny before reaching Nottingham on Wednesday, where he stayed at Ruddington. Here, forces led by George, Lord Strange and Sir John Savage joined them. After leaving Tadcaster, the rebels' movements are unclear, until they passed southward on the Friday the 15th, but it's likely they took the route shown in order to gain supplies and food for the troops. The same day, Henry's forces moved to Ratcliffe in response to news that the rebels were approaching. On the morning of the battle, after he had heard 2 masses, Henry was given 5 local men from Ratcliffe, who knew well the country and showed where there were marshes, villages, groves for ambushes or straight ways. Henry gave 2 of these guys to Oxford, who was to lead the vanguard of the Royal Army, consisting of around 6,000 men, whilst 9,000 men would advance in 2 columns, with Henry leading the main body and the rearguard commanded by Lord Strange. The sources conflict over the direction the Royal Army approached Stoke, with the Herald reporting what we believed happened, whilst Polydore Virgil reported that Royal forces had entered Newark the day before and had to head back south to confront the rebel army. It is probable that Oxford advanced via the Upper Foss, which can be seen running from Sileston across the ridge before it emerges at Stoke in Humber Lane. This is probably the route the guards from Ratcliffe would have taken them, and why they needed their assistance to avoid ambushes. Henry's forces probably approached along the Foss Way, and he probably worked on the likelihood that the rebel army would fight a defensive battle. Therefore, Oxford could halt his forces and wait for the rest of the Royal Army to arrive. The rebel army were waiting for them, having crossed the Trent probably at Fiskerton the evening before. The river would have been much wider and shallower than it is today. Following their own prayers, the rebel army, consisting of around 8,000 men, took up their positions on Burham Hill and across the ridge, waiting for Oxford's men to arrive and take up their positions. Whilst the rebel leaders had probably planned to maintain their position on the high ground, they may have thought their best chance was to attack Oxford before Henry and the main body arrived. It is probable that Lincoln was in the centre, with Schwartz to his right and Fitzgerald's Irish on his left, although this is far from certain. At about 9 o'clock in the morning, the rebel army moved down from the lofty position to attack Oxford's troops, which consisted of a body of infantry flanked by a wing of cavalry on either side, although the cavalry may have dismounted to fight on foot. As the armies closed together, any artillery the Royalists had with them would have opened up, before they closed within range of the archers between 250 and 300 yards. As they closed further, Schwartz's mercenaries would have been put to use at around 200 yards, but due to the time taken to reload, they probably only got off 1 shot. The Royalist archers had a devastating effect on the poorly armoured Irish, with one source reporting that they were shot through and full of arrows like hedgehogs. When the armies clashed together in hand-to-hand conflict, Oxford's experienced men stood their ground. Whilst another source records that the battle lasted for 3 hours, it's unlikely to have lasted this long. And as time wore on, the likelihood of the rebels breaking through lessened. With the possible arrival of some of the King's division and with a greater professionalism, Oxford's men moved forward, and it's probable the rebel left wing, consisting of the Irish, gave way. As the Royalist army pushed the rebels back towards Stoke village, their positions began to disintegrate, and it became a rout. Many of the rebels would have fled down the steep banks towards the river, and legend has it that the Red Gutter is so named because it ran red with blood. However, it's more likely that it was so named because of the exposed Cooper Mile clay. A local legend surrounds a spring close to the battlefield that became known as the Willow Tree. It is said that it quenched the thirst of a dying soldier after he prayed for water to his patron saint as he lay fatally injured on Elston Lane, and pure clear water immediately gushed from a nearby bank. The Earl of Lincoln is supposedly buried near the spot. An advertiser report from 2010 says that work on the duelling of the A46 has caused the spring to dry up, and a recent visit could find no sign of it, but photograph a willow tree near the spot. Following the battle, King Henry and Oxford went to the place where the rebel army had formed up and raised the royal standard on the spot. Later, Newark Archaeological and Local History Society erected this stone on the spot in 1987. Lincoln, Schwartz and Fitzgerald were all killed, although Henry was furious as he had wanted Lincoln taken alive for questioning into any other plots against him. Dead men can't tell tales. Lambert Simnel was captured and spared. He was put to work in the royal kitchens, supposedly as a turnspit, and according to later reports became a falconer. It was probably a lucky escape for him, as if the Yorkers had won, he would almost certainly have been disposed of, allowing Lincoln to take the throne. English and Irish commoner prisoners were executed for treason. A few noblemen were taken for questioning. The mercenaries were disarmed and allowed to go home. The total death toll was reckoned at 7,000, with only light casualties on the Tudor side. Following the battle, Henry rested at Newark for several days before heading north. A Tudor rose and Henry's insignia are part of a stained glass window in St Mary Magdalen that commemorated his visit. Henry would face one more threat from impostor Burke in Warbeck in 1497, but there was no battle. The last battle of the Wars of the Roses was fought just a few miles from Newark. Richard Brooke, visiting in 1825, was told that the remains of many slain were found. They were interred in long trenches, but very few indications of armour or weapons were discovered. However, the labourers found 2 spurs, one of which they purloined, the other Sir Robert Bromley, who lived at Stoke Hall, obtained. It is of silver on the outside and of steel within, and is of considerable beauty and elegance of workmanship, with roses boldly embossed on its surface. In 1982, workmen digging a drainage ditch uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of 11 men. One of the arms had an iron ring around it, possibly a manacle. The remains were transferred to Newark and Shore Museum Service, and in 2012, Peter Masters from Cranford University asked to do some analysis of the remains. Most were of healthy, well-fed men. One skeleton had evidence of a dislocated thigh, possibly resulting from rickets. The only intact skull was from a youth of about 20. He had a blow to the ear which was probably fatal, but also evidence of healed earlier wounds. In 2018, the Battlefields Trust installed new interpretation panels around the battlefield and, in partnership with Nottinghamshire County Council, produced a downloadable trail of the battlefield. Henry VII died in 1509 and was succeeded by Henry VIII. Most people will be familiar with the story of his 6 wives and his break with the authority of the Pope in Rome, so he could divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn. This brought about the English Reformation, which had both immediate and long-lasting effects on Newark and the whole country. At this time, churchmen played political roles, such as Cardinal Wolsey. A friend of Wolsey, who became an ambassador for Henry, was Thomas Magnus. Magnus had been born in Newark and, according to one story, had been abandoned on the steps of the church, although in his will he mentioned his mother, father and 3 sisters. He rose for the church to become Archdeacon of the East Riding of Yorkshire in 1504. He was employed as a diplomat between 1509 to 19 and again between 1524 and 1527, and was present at the Field of the Cloth of Gold near Calais in 1520. In particular, he was ambassador to Henry's sister Margaret Tudor and a son, James V of Scotland, between 1524 and 1525. He died in 1550 and is buried in Cessay, North Yorkshire, where the brass effigy is mounted. He never forgot his birthplace, and at a time when many clergymen were founding schools, he gave the town a legacy that lives on to this day. The Magnus deed establishing the Song and Grammar Schools is dated 21st of February 1531. The original schoolroom, completed in 1532, is now the Tudor Hall of the National Civil War Centre. The school was a free school, so no fees were payable, but you needed a degree of wealth to be able to afford to send sons to school. The school gave pupils an education that prepared them for university, mainly Cambridge, and a career either in the church or in law. The Song School was set up to maintain a high standard of worship in the parish church. They would have been paid for through income from farms and land gifted for the purpose. Both the school and Song School still exist, as does the Magnus charity. Other important charities were also established around this time. A year later, in September 1532, Magnus's friend Robert Brown's deed gave his estates in Newark, Balderton and Coddington for the good of the town, to be administered by the vicar or the alderman of the Trinity Guild. In 1556, William Philpott made a will giving valuable estates to the borough. He made provisions for an almshouse to support 5 poor men and a chapel on Coddington Lane. The chapel still stands on Bedehouse Lane, but the almshouses have long since disappeared. This charity also helped supplement the wages of the grammar school master and went towards the paving and upkeep of the streets. All of these charities still exist in one form or another. In 1534, Henry VIII's arguments with the Pope over his divorce led to a reform of the Church. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared that the King was the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England, and the Treasons Act of 1534 made it high treason, punishable by death, to refuse the oath of supremacy acknowledging the King as such. This led to the dissolution of the monasteries, which in Newark meant the end of the Friary and Chauncey House, and the Chantry chapels no longer having priests to pray for the dead. In 1536, there were two uprisings against these changes. The Lincolnshire Rising was a brief rising by Roman Catholics against the establishment of the Church of England and the dissolution of the monasteries, and was set in motion by Thomas Cromwell. The rising began on 1st of October 1536 at Louth. 22,000 people were estimated to have joined the rising. The demonstrators marched on Lincoln and occupied Lincoln Cathedral, demanding the freedom to continue worshipping as Roman Catholics and protection for the treasures of the Lincolnshire churches. The protest effectively ended on the 4th of October 1536, when the King sent word for the occupiers to disperse or face the forces of Charles Brandon, 1st Duke of Suffolk. By the 14th of October, few remained in Lincoln. Following the rising, the Vicar of Louth and Captain Cobbler, two of the main leaders, were captured and hanged at Tyburn. The Lincolnshire Rising helped inspire the more widespread pilgrimage of grace. The movement broke out on the 13th of October 1536. Robert Aske was chosen to lead the rebels and led a band of 9,000 followers who entered and occupied York. He arranged for expelled monks and nuns to return to their houses, the king's newly installed tenants were driven out, and Catholic observances were resumed. The Earl of Shrewsbury brought royalist troops to Newark, where he made his headquarters before heading north. The Duke of Norfolk and Marquess of Exeter's forces were sent as reinforcements to meet at Newark, where they would be joined by the Duke of Suffolk. In the event, Exeter was redirected. The aim was to keep the rebels north of the Trent, where they might be forced to disperse for lack of food. There was a known Scots gun emplacement in a coppice at Smeaton's Lakes, and there has been a suggestion that it might have had an earlier role to block the progress of the Pilgrimage of Grace down the Great North Road. Excavations there in 2018 found some evidence of 16th century pottery, so this remains a possibility. Norfolk and Shrewsbury's forces were united at Doncaster on the 25th of October, but only numbered around 8,000, and the king urged Norfolk to avoid battle unless certain of victory. Aske and the rebel forces arrived the following day. Negotiations began with the insurgents near Doncaster, where Aske had assembled between 30 and 40,000 people. Norfolk promised a general pardon and a parliament to be held at York within a year, as well as a reprieve for the abbeys until the parliament had met. Naively trusting the king's promises, Aske dismissed his followers. In February 1537 there was a new rising in Cumberland and Westmoreland called Bigod's Rebellion under Sir Francis Bigod. Because he knew the promises he had made on behalf of the king would not be met, Norfolk reacted quickly to the new uprising after the pilgrims failed to disperse. The rebellion failed, and Bigod, Aske, and several other rebels were arrested. All were convicted of treason and executed. Robert Aske was executed and then hung in chains at York. In total, 216 were executed. And by August 1538, Father Henry Leland, Vicar of Newark, had joined them. In 1534, Father Leland advised his congregation against reading heretical books containing anti-papal rhetoric and preached highly derogatory sermons against royal supremacy. He would have been well aware that giving such sermons might have led him to being charged with treason, but must have believed firmly that it was defending the truth. As Vicar of Newark, he spoke against the king, saying because of his actions he was not a Christian. Later, in 1538, Father Henry was informed of the proposed destruction of the shrine of St. Thomas of Canterbury. The saint's bones were to be disinterred and publicly burned, and the treasure of the shrine taken for the king. Father Henry, knowing that the same fate would await the shrine of St. Hugh at Lincoln Cathedral, was outraged and spoke out against what he considered to be unacceptable and intolerable sacrilege. He resigned his position at the cathedral, making his displeasure known to members of the chapter and to all that would listen. Father Henry was arrested for his opposition to the king and the new religion by John Horsley. For his troubles, Horsley was paid £100 by the king for Father Henry's delivery to York Assizes, a small fortune at the time. Father Henry was accused of two charges: speaking against the king as a new head of the English Church, and financing rebels who participated in the Pilgrimage of Grace in Yorkshire. Following his trial and on his route back to his prison cell, he would have seen Clifford's Tower. But the previous year, Robert Aske had been executed and left to hang in chains. Father Henry Leland was hung, drawn and quartered at York on the 2nd of August 1538. Henry VIII died in 1547 and was succeeded by his 9-year-old son Edward. In the beginning of Edward VI's reign, the Bishop of Lincoln gave the castle and manor of Newark to the Crown. In 1549, the town was incorporated and authority was invested in an alderman and 12 assistants, until 1625 when a mayor and 12 aldermen took over. When Edward died in 1553, he was succeeded by his sister Mary, who returned the country to Catholicism and countered many of the reforms put in place by the Protestant Edward. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth came to the throne and returned the country to a less extreme Protestantism. During their reigns, a number of important changes happened in Newark. In 1561, armorial bearings in the form of a crest were granted to the borough by Queen Elizabeth. In 1579, a renewed charter gave the town a recorder and its own coroner. And in 1585, an Act of Parliament was passed for the paving of the streets of Newark. Around this period, possibly in 1594, there was a dispute over the waters driving the mills in Newark. At that time it would appear there was only a small brook that ran through Aram, Kelham and Moscombe. The influential Sutton family who lived at Aram made a cut to the Trent near Farndon. This reduced the amount of water that flowed through Newark to drive the mills, so the millers and people of Newark sued. As a result, the Sutton family were directed to build and maintain a weir in order to make sure sufficient water flowed to the mills at Newark. It is believed that this map was produced to show the castles and mills along the Trent. Newark Castle appears very Gothic on the far right in this painting. As a result of the castle and manor of Newark being transferred to the Crown, there were a number of changes in ownership of properties that would be important later. In 1560, the castle was leased from the Crown by Sir Francis Leake of Sutton Scarsdale in Derbyshire, but in 1573, the Earl of Rutland petitioned the Queen to purchase the whole of the manor of Newark, including the castle. On the expiry of Francis Leake's lease in 1581, the castle was leased to the Earl of Rutland. In January 1589, Elizabeth Manners, daughter of the Earl of Rutland, married William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, son of Thomas Cecil, 1st Earl of Exeter. William succeeded to the title of 2nd Earl of Exeter and built a house on the former site of St Leonard's Hospital, which became known as Exeter House. The Friary and Chauncey House were also owned by Francis Leake as early as 1605. His son, also Francis, was raised to the peerage in 1624 as Baron Danecourt of Sutton Scarsdale. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth died and the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I and the first Stuart king. On his way to London on the 21st of April 1603, James was received at Newark Castle before departing for Belvoir Castle the following day, which was Good Friday. He was presented with a gilt cup on behalf of the corporation, and John Twentyman gave an address in Latin that the king was so pleased with that he made him purveyor of wax for the royal household in Nottinghamshire, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and Derbyshire. This was the grandfather of John Twentyman, whose diary gave eyewitness accounts of Civil War events, and there is a record of the Twentyman family at the Saracen's Head from 1590. King James also visited Newark in 1616 and 1617. In 1620 there was a mention of the annual races which took place at Coniston Moor, and in 1622 a new pillory was erected near the cross in the marketplace. In 1625 James I died and was succeeded by his second son Charles. Charles I visited Newark a number of times before Civil War broke out in 1642. That association with Newark during the Civil War will be an important part of the story covered in the next presentation.